Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, 1968. In a war fought with helicopters, artillery barrages, and massive patrols sweeping through jungle valleys, it would be a single footprint pressed into wet soil that changed everything. For months, a Viet Cong battalion had vanished into the jungle like smoke. American intelligence had searched relentlessly. Patrol after patrol pushed through dense vegetation, combing rivers, hills, and villages. Yet every mission ended the same way. Empty campsites, cold fire pits, and booby traps waiting for the next unlucky soldier to find them. The enemy was always one step ahead. What follows is a dramatization built around documented methods of Commonwealth special operations in Vietnam, specifically the tracking and reconnaissance techniques practiced by Australian and New Zealand SAS units in Phuoc Tuy Province during 1968. The specific characters, patrol designations, and operational details are illustrative. The tactical reality they represent is historical, because sometimes the jungle does not hide the enemy. Sometimes it whispers where they are. And if someone knows how to listen, the entire war can begin to unravel from a single trace in the mud. The hidden enemy. The jungle stood like a living wall beneath the rising sun, dense and silent. Somewhere inside that green labyrinth, hundreds of Viet Cong fighters had simply disappeared. Allied intelligence had hunted them for months. Large patrols crashed through the bush on a regular schedule, hacking through vines and wading through swamps. They found nothing of value. No headquarters, no supply depots, no sign of where the enemy slept or planned their attacks. The Viet Cong were winning simply by vanishing. Before first light, a small SAS patrol prepared for insertion inside a dimly lit operations shelter. The air was already heavy, thick enough to feel like breathing through wet cloth. Outside, artillery crews were readying guns for another day of bombardments that often struck nothing more consequential than empty jungle. The patrol spread the map across a folding table. Red circles marked the areas where the enemy had not been found. 2 weeks in the field. Absolute noise discipline. No engagement unless contact was forced. Everything the patrol needed would be carried on their backs. Once inserted, the patrol would operate alone. No resupply. No support within immediate reach. Intelligence reports indicated that an experienced Viet Cong provincial battalion was operating somewhere in the region. Fighters who knew every meter of that jungle better than any foreign soldier could hope to. They had names for every trail, every stream, every patch of ground soft enough to conceal an ambush. Some of the older cadres had once fought the Japanese and later the French. Others had grown up in the long shadow of those wars. And now they were fighting the Americans, and in this part of the war, they were winning. At times, the jungle itself seemed to fight on their side. The jungle war. The forest was not simply terrain. It was an opponent. 3 layers of vegetation blocked most of the sunlight from reaching the ground. A man could stand 10 meters away and remain entirely invisible. Humidity pressed down through everything, soaking clothes, skin, and weapons until rifles became slippery in a soldier's hands. Before noon, the temperature would climb past 35 degrees Celsius and stay there. Vines caught at arms and necks. Thorny plants tore exposed skin. Cicadas screamed at a volume that masked the sound of footsteps, yours and the enemy's alike. Every soldier carried a substantial load. Rifle, ammunition, rations, water purification, medical supplies. Streams could not be trusted. Disease lived in every drop. One wrong step onto a hidden punji stake could mean infection and a slow death. One careless clink of metal could bring gunfire from an enemy no one had ever seen. The Viet Cong had built their entire strategy around this environment. Their shelters were narrow underground positions covered in leaves, invisible from a few paces away. They moved mostly at night, while Allied troops rested behind fortified perimeters. Their intelligence network extended into every village and market. Farmers, traders, and ordinary civilians quietly observed the trails and reported what they saw. American doctrine favored controlling territory, taking high ground, building fire support bases, sending large patrols to dominate key terrain. The Viet Cong followed a simpler rule: let the jungle do the work. Reading the jungle. The patrol's lead tracker had spent months watching large operations pound the jungle without result. He had seen it from the beginning, big patrols moving loudly, covering ground quickly, finding nothing, helicopters announcing their arrival long before boots touched the earth, artillery smashing hillsides that were empty before the first shell landed, search and destroy missions that often had nothing to destroy. He believed something different. You did not find a patient, experienced enemy by hunting for him directly. You found him by reading what he had left behind. The jungle, he had come to understand, told stories. You only had to learn the language. The first sign. In the grey half-light before dawn, the patrol slipped through the perimeter wire and disappeared into the jungle shadows. The tracker moved at the front. Behind him, the radio operator followed. 2 more soldiers spread out in a loose formation, roughly 20 meters apart, each watching a different angle of the surrounding trees. Their uniforms were darkened, faces muddied. They moved the way the jungle moved, slow, patient, careful. Several hundred meters from the base, the tracker stopped. His fist rose. The patrol froze instantly. The others could not see what he saw, but they trusted him enough to become statues in the trees. He crouched beside the ground, near a faint trail that barely qualified as one. There, pressed into damp black soil, still soft from the previous night's rain, was a footprint. Not an American boot, not a South Vietnamese pattern. A sandal, the kind cut from old tire rubber that Viet Cong fighters wore throughout the war. Commonwealth SAS trackers had been trained to identify them by shape, depth, and the way weight distributed across the sole. The tracker had seen hundreds, but it was not the print itself that held his attention. It was the direction. The footprint pointed away from every known trail, heading into terrain that intelligence maps had labeled as uninhabitable swamp ground, so waterlogged and hostile that it had been dismissed as operationally useless. He ran his fingers along the edges of the impression, still soft, recent. A single fighter, moving with purpose, not wandering, going somewhere specific. He looked up at the green wall ahead, the swamp that every previous patrol had ignored, and something clicked into focus. The enemy had hidden their base in the one place no one thought to search. Impossible terrain equaled perfect safety. He turned toward the radio operator and spoke in a whisper. "That's our thread. Pull it carefully." The patrol moved forward into the swamp. The jungle closed behind them. In the days that followed, the patrol moved through the swamp like shadows, and in doing so, demonstrated that much of what large Allied formations believed about finding the enemy in Vietnam had been wrong from the beginning. Before dawn, the jungle lay in absolute darkness. Around the hidden Viet Cong position, SAS soldiers lay motionless in the undergrowth. For 2 full days they had crept into position, following the hidden trails the tracker had mapped during his reconnaissance. Every sentry post he had sketched in his notebook had been identified and avoided. Every movement had been made only after nightfall, when the fighters inside believed themselves secure in their untouchable fortress. The base had remained undiscovered for months precisely because it occupied terrain that military planners considered impossible to use. No one had expected an attack from that direction. Over time, guards had stopped watching it carefully. Confidence can kill as surely as bullets. The jungle was alive with its ordinary sounds. Insects clicked and hummed. Frogs called from the swamp. Fruit bats swept through the canopy in the darkness above. The SAS soldiers had learned to move within that noise, timing each step with the wind, becoming still whenever the night went quiet. They avoided anything with a strong scent. Even insect repellent was used sparingly. Mosquitoes fed on their necks and arms throughout the night. No one raised a hand. Each man lay exactly where he had been placed, knowing his field of fire and the signal he was waiting for. For 2 days they had rehearsed the assault in hushed whispers, building the attack inside their minds from the tracker's observations. No artillery preparation, no air support, no flares. What was coming would arrive without warning. The first shot, as the first grey light of dawn seeped through the jungle canopy. Black shadows softened into deep green shapes. Visibility stretched outward from 10 meters to 15. A Viet Cong sentry stretched and shifted his weapon beside his post. 8 months without discovery had settled into routine. The jungle had protected them so far. The tracker lined up his shot, a slow breath, a controlled squeeze. The rifle made a sound no louder than a twig snapping. The sentry collapsed forward without a sound. For 3 seconds nothing changed. The jungle continued its morning chorus. Then the attack began. Inside the camp, the SAS did not open their assault with artillery or airstrikes. They did not warn the enemy with distant explosions or the beating of rotor blades across the forest. They had closed to within close range before opening fire. Among Special Forces soldiers who operated this way in Vietnam, the principle was understood: get inside the enemy's defensive perimeter before he can organize a response. When the shooting started, the attackers were already inside the camp. Bunkers that had been constructed to face outward toward the jungle were suddenly under fire from within their own perimeter. The Viet Cong woke into chaos. They had rehearsed responses to American attacks many times. Artillery gave them minutes to reach underground positions. Helicopter blades gave them more time still. But there had been no warning today. No distant guns, no aircraft. The attackers had simply appeared inside the wire, intercepted communications later, suggested that commanders struggled to understand what had happened. Soldiers were taking fire from positions that should have contained nothing but jungle, the killing ground. As the assault developed, groups of Viet Cong fighters attempted to break out through what they believed was their hidden escape route. A submerged causeway through the swamp. A path they had considered a secret, known only to themselves. They did not know it had already been identified. Other SAS soldiers had been lying in ambush along that causeway since before midnight, positioned there on the basis of the trackers' reconnaissance. For hours they had waited in mud and insects, trusting that the enemy would run exactly where the patrol had predicted. When the fleeing fighters reached the waterline, the trap closed. The SAS opened fire across the causeway with automatic rifles and machine guns. The escape route the base had depended on had become a killing ground. Within minutes the firing stopped. The swamp was quiet again. The aftermath. Within little more than an hour, the base had been destroyed. Its communications severed, its ammunition cache detonated, and its capacity to function as a command element eliminated. The intelligence recovered from the operation was extensive. Maps revealed supply routes feeding guerrilla activity across a wide area. Documents identified operational plans and personnel. A political officer captured during the assault was carrying materials sealed in a waterproof pouch. Reports later suggested the patrol withdrew without confirmed casualties. The intelligence gained triggered a series of follow-up operations in the months that followed. The provincial battalion targeted in the raid lost a substantial portion of its combat strength and required an extended period to rebuild. For the remainder of 1968, Viet Cong units in Phuoc Tuy Province reportedly avoided the deep jungle areas where Commonwealth SAS patrols had operated. Villagers in the province would later describe hearing stories about soldiers who moved like shadows and appeared without warning. The truth was less mysterious, but no less remarkable. They had simply learned to read the ground. The real lesson. Interrogations of captured fighters returned to the same central theme. They had believed they were invisible. They had trusted the jungle to protect them in the way it always had. And then men had appeared out of the darkness and killed them before they could respond. The methods demonstrated by Commonwealth SAS trackers in Phuoc Tuy spread quietly among special operations units. Australian SAS formations incorporated tracking doctrine into their standard operating procedures. American special operations personnel studied what New Zealand and Australian operators had developed in the field. The underlying principle found its way into small unit leader training across multiple allied forces. Patience and knowledge of the ground could produce results that firepower and numbers could not. But the larger machinery of the war barely shifted. Helicopters still thundered into landing zones. Artillery still worked over jungle hillsides. Large patrols still moved through the bush on schedules that the enemy could predict. Big armies adapt slowly, even when shown a better way. Viet Cong units in the region rebuilt over time. The strategic contest in Vietnam continued on terms that small unit excellence could not resolve by itself. Tactical brilliance is not the same as strategic clarity. The tracker proved that small teams with patience and deep understanding could operate effectively in the enemy's own environment. But the war was not being fought primarily on those terms. While trackers read footprints in the mud, the larger command structure counted different things and measured different outcomes. Both approaches existed in the same jungle. They rarely seemed to be fighting the same war. The tracking methods developed and refined in Phuoc Tuy Province did not disappear when the war ended. Commonwealth Special Operations doctrine carried them forward. Decades later, elements of these techniques were still being taught to special operations personnel preparing for service in other difficult environments. The ground, the principle held, always tells you something. You only have to know how to ask. Never chase the enemy. Read the terrain. The land will tell you where he has been, and if you're patient enough, where he is going.